World War II, a war to define a century, a war in which its devastation is still being felt today. World War II shook the European continent and was a conflict of never before seen caliber. Looking back, one may wonder how someone as radical and evil as Fuhrer Adolf Hitler could have rose from the ruins of Germany to completely dominate the continent and initiate a worldwide conflict. How could a man be so influential? How could a conflict escalate to the degree that it did? The answer? Propaganda. Propaganda is defined as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Allied and Central Powers alike used propaganda to gain and maintain support from their people for their respective ideals and policies. However, no other state used propaganda as masterfully as Germany. Infiltrating politics, social life, fine art, and pop culture, propaganda manipulated European societies leading up to and throughout World War II, securing the acquiescence of the public and the enabling of Hitler's actions, and further contributing to the conflict's development from another war to a definitive moment in history. A number of factors contributed to the rise of World War II, most rooted in the poor decisions made at the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles' War Guilt Clause assigns complete blame unto Germany, along with massive war reparations that destroyed the German economy. The poverty and humiliation felt by Germans planted a nationwide seed of bitterness that Hitler would later sow. The Weimar Republic that formed after World War I was a moderate democracy that did little to enact change. The complacent atmosphere created by the Weimar Republic was conducive for radical beliefs to popularize, and thus the radically conservative Nazi Party took center stage. Coupled with the influence of propaganda, this led to Hitler's destructive reign. Even before anti Semitic legislations were made, Hitler used propaganda to create a violence tolerant atmosphere in Germany, in which this violence was directed towards Jews. Propaganda also encouraged acceptance of such anti Semitic policies, both by the Jews and by non persecuted German commoners. Nazis disguised their prejudiced actions as simply restoring order within Germany. With the implementation of anti Semitic policies and the execution of so called final solution, propaganda was used both to stir up anti Semitic thoughts, justify their prejudices, and deceive the public that the Jewish camps were simply harmless labor centers. Political cartoons in the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer used caricatures that exaggerated Jewish stereotypes to instill anti Semitism within its readers. Inversely, Jews at concentration camps were required to send home postcards describing their stay positively and that they were in good hands with the Nazis. In reality, however, these Jews would be sent to the gas chambers in a few short days. German films like The Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, reinforced nationalism within the German public. Much of Hitler's campaign relied upon the average German's pride of his country. Films like Riefenstahl's further intensified these ideals. Propaganda films depicted the Nazi regime positively to reassure Germans that their actions were just and morally right. The Triumph of the Will used precise cinematography, like low angles, to depict Hitler as macho, powerful, and resilient. The film gathered footage from the 1935 Nuremberg rally and conveyed Hitler's talents as a public speaker. Overall, the film is a prime example of Nazi propaganda as it resonated within the German public, instilling a dangerous nationalistic pride and rallying massive support for Hitler. The propaganda created support, created acquiescence among European societies, allowing Hitler to implement the malicious policies that he did. As propaganda spread, Hitler's regime gradually affected most of the European continent. Outside of Germany, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda focused propaganda abroad to depict the regime as a rational group, making rational requests. With Hitler as chancellor, Germany became bold in their desires to retain lost lands from the Treaty of Versailles. For example, the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia had a large ethnically German population. Hitler wanted to expand Germany's borders to include this region, which would violate the terms stated in the Treaty of Versailles. He needed the Allied powers' permission in order to achieve this. Hitler's answer? Propaganda. He would make speeches and advocate that his request to occupy the Sudetenland only made logical sense, using the region's ethnically German population as leverage. It was important that Hitler carry a benevolent facade to foreign onlookers. However, his desire of the Sudetenland was rooted in his personal agenda to dominate the continent. In the end, Hitler's manipulation and intimidation of Allied powers granted him the Sudetenland in the Munich Agreement, securing him these expanded borders and the weapon manufacturing resources of the area. Hitler and the Reich's propaganda ministry advertised their accomplishments, instilling nationalist Nazi beliefs through multiple outlets. Propaganda infiltrated every aspect of life in World War II era Germany. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda strove to ensure that the Nazi message was communicated to the public through every sphere: newspapers, radio, books, fine art, and film. The propaganda ministry launched an entire campaign on, quote, degenerate art, condemning abstract and expressionist art as dirty and wrong. 20,000 Entartet Kunst pieces were removed from state museums. An exhibit of degenerate art was put on display in Munich in 1937, in which mainly modern, expressionist, and abstract art was sloppily thrown onto walls with harsh captions. The exhibit of, quote, genetically inferior art implied that self-expression was a factor in society's moral decline. The implication was used to suppress opposition from individuals in society. Alternatively, an exhibit of acceptable Nazi-approved art was also organized. Classical works and antiquities glorifying the ideal masculine body and German nationalistic works were displayed in Munich as well, but in an honorable fashion, so as to further instill the Nazi ideals of power and the existence of a perfect Aryan race. The film industry was also used to push the Nazi agenda. Der Ehrliche Jude was an anti-Semitic film that depicted Jews as thieving, sex-crazed parasites of society. One scene in particular compares the Jews to a rat, a thing bringing contagion and disease to the continent and depleting resources. The film was used to intensify stereotypes and anti-Semitism within Germans. The film was a direct product of the Nazi government, with people as high-ranked as Joseph Goebbels playing a part in its production. Mr. Goebbels, tell us about your background. Why were you selected to head the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda? Before I joined the Nazi Party in 1924, I was a man with few accomplishments. I had an education and talents in literature and film, but was without a way to express them. Among other Nazis, I was a talented individual, and they praised me for my abilities to convey their beliefs on paper. This allowed me to rise up through the ranks. The Fuhrer eventually chose me to head the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. What did your day-to-day duties entail as the Reich's Minister of Propaganda? As the head of the propaganda ministry, I was responsible for creating Hitler's image as the Fuhrer, one of a strong, powerful, all-knowing leader. I conveyed our Nazi beliefs in newspapers and films and designed posters. All of these were intended to create political agitation, and I would say I was very successful in my duties. Not even children were spared from the political agitation created by propaganda. Children's books were tainted with anti-Semitism and Nazi ideals to install these dangerous beliefs within all generations. The book, The Poisonous Mushroom, was a children's book that thoroughly examined Jews, their origins, their inferiority, and the apparent danger that they imposed on society. Nazi Germany is a prime example of how propaganda can intensify international conflicts. Through his expert use of propaganda, Hitler was able to win over the entire German nation, manipulate other powers, and gain support for his hatred-based radical ideals. Hitler said in his memoir, Mein Kampf, "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." Time and time again, history serves as a warning to the future that ignorance is dangerous and that we cannot let past events repeat themselves.